After Margaret Sullivan died, her daughter told the world the chilling truth about her mother. She revealed what really went down in the notorious love triangle between her mother, Henry Fonda, and Jimmy Stewart, and the truth was more scandalous than anyone expected. Born in 1909 in Virginia, Sullivan was a frail child and suffered from a painful muscular weakness in her legs that affected her ability to walk. She wasn't well enough to socialise with any children her age until she was 6 years old, leading to an immensely lonely existence. Her snooty parents had ideas about who their daughter should befriend and wanted her to associate only with people of a certain class. So they were appalled when Sullivan, who was quickly turning into an adventurous tomboy, became friends with the boys from the poorer neighbourhoods. Up until 1927, Sullivan's well-to-do parents still held out hope that their daughter would become a society darling. Sullivan dashed those hopes when she moved to Boston to study drama and dance, a theatrical line of profession that her parents thought was gauche. They cut her allowance to the bare minimum in an attempt to pressure her back home, but she rolled up her sleeves and got a job to make ends meet. In 1929, Sullivan landed a role in the prestigious Harvard Dramatic Society's production of Close Up. One of her co-stars was future Hollywood hunk Henry Fonda, who she was supposed to slap in one of the scenes. Every time Sullivan had to slap Fonda's character, whether it was a rehearsal or the real thing, she gave it her absolute all and delivered, as Fonda later recalled, a rock-solid slap to his chiselled moneymaker. Still, this beating had a strange effect on the young Fonda. Far from backing away from Sullivan, he ended up being into her, but he had competition. Fonda's best friend was the sweetly awkward Jimmy Stewart. Naturally, Sullivan inserted herself into their group, and the trio became exceedingly close friends. So close that Stewart started to fall for the vivacious actress too. Finally, after plucking up the courage, Stewart decided to take the plunge and ask Sullivan out. She described it as the longest, slowest, shyest, but most sincere proposal she ever received. But Stewart had a reputation for being a player, so Sullivan turned him down. Then Fonda swooped in. Fonda and Sullivan struck up a passionate romance, and on Christmas Day 1931 they tied the knot. But this was no fairy tale marriage. In truth, Fonda and Sullivan didn't make the best match, even if they had been friends beforehand. Where Fonda was notoriously cold and closed off, Sullivan was the exact opposite. She had no problem speaking her mind freely and loudly, and she had an explosive temper to boot. For all their efforts, they were only married for a paltry 2 months, separating before the honeymoon period was even over in early 1932. And then Sullivan's life really started to pick up. By the 1930s, she was one of the hottest stars on Broadway. Like clockwork, Hollywood started to take notice, with director John M. Stahl seeking her out to be in his next film. Sullivan's response was surprising. She didn't want to give up her control to studios, had already said no to Paramount and Columbia, and thought about turning Stahl down too. In the end, the director made her an offer she couldn't refuse. A multi-picture deal and a clause that she could return to tread the boards whenever she wanted. Suddenly, Margaret was going to Hollywood, but it did not begin well. Sullivan confused old Hollywood from the get-go, and her starlet antics became infamous. She rolled up to sunny, sophisticated Los Angeles in old slacks, sneakers, and sweaters, all while driving her beat-up Ford. Quite simply, Margaret Sullivan did not give a damn about glamour, and she wanted everyone to know it. Industry professionals soon knew Sullivan by reputation alone, and that reputation wasn't good. She would show up to photo shoots barefoot, horrifying photographers. Likewise, she nixed the studio's idea that she get one of her crooked teeth fixed. You took Margaret as she was, or you didn't take her at all. But this made her some big enemies. Even studio head honcho Louis B. Mayer, one of the most infamously cruel and powerful men in Hollywood, was wary of the strong-willed actress. Mayer's aide, Eddie Mannix, once confessed that Sullivan was the only player who outbullied Mayer. Her wrath was already terrifying before she went to Hollywood, but it became downright deadly. On one occasion, she got into a spat with director Sam Wood over a writer he wanted to fire and she wanted to keep. Their argument was so explosive, Wood suffered a heart attack immediately after and died. Sullivan was not a woman to cross. Her first film role was in John Stahl's 1933 film Only Yesterday. It was supposed to be a moment to bask in her success, but it turned into a disaster. When Sullivan saw the rough cuts of her scenes, she was so embarrassed by her performance that she begged the studio to let her buy out her contract. They said no, and Sullivan waited for the worst. Sullivan was wrong about Only Yesterday. Critics loved her performance, with one reviewer praising how she played the heroine with forthright sympathy, wise reticence, and honest feeling, and calling her one to watch. With all eyes on her, Sullivan made her next move, and it shocked everyone. In 1935, Sullivan was on the set of director William Wyler's The Good Fairy, playing an orphan girl. But behind the scenes, all was not so rosy. Sullivan, in classic fashion, was at odds with Wyler almost the entire time, and fought brazenly with him whenever she got the chance. Then suddenly, their hate turned to something else. Wyler and Sullivan actually realised they didn't hate each other, they were actually in love. They eloped in 1934, before The Good Fairy even came out. It was Sullivan's second marriage and Wyler's first, but it was still one pretty bad idea. Around this time, Sullivan started ham-fistedly campaigning around town to get her old friend Jimmy Stewart through some big studio doors in Hollywood. In particular, she wanted him in her upcoming film, Next Time We Love, having been convinced since their theatre days that he could be a huge star. Sullivan may have been gung-ho about Stewart, but nobody else was. In fact, when she started pestering executives to hire her old buddy, they didn't even know who he was. In the end, Sullivan got her way, because the studio was afraid that she'd go on strike in retaliation if they turned her down. Sullivan had staked a bet on Stewart, and now she was on the hook for every issue the studio had with him. She was damned if she was going to get herself humiliated, and she went into overdrive to turn Stewart into leading man material. She spent long nights with him, helping him soften his abrupt mannerisms and tentative speech patterns into the iconic style we know today. As the director Edward Griffith himself even had to admit, it was Margaret Sullivan who made James Stewart a star. While all this was going on, Sullivan was still very much married to William Wyler, and he did not take at all kindly to the idea of his wife spending her nights with Stewart. According to insiders, the director grew overwhelmingly suspicious of these midnight lessons as the days wore on. While Sullivan's affections remain murky, one thing was for sure: Stewart was in love. Unable to cope with the breaches of trust, her marriage to William Wyler broke down entirely, and they divorced after less than 2 years together. But did she fly into Jimmy's arms? No. Instead, just months after her split, she married another man, her agent, Leland Hayward. Rebound marriages aren't a good idea for anyone, but they're even worse if your name is Margaret Sullivan. Although she moved in with Hayward after the wedding, she made sure to pick a house that was just down the street from, you guessed it, her friend Jimmy Stewart. Sullivan's third marriage started out well enough. After marrying, they had 3 children in quick succession: Brooke, Bill, and Bridget. For a moment, it looked like Sullivan had finally put all the drama behind her and was settling down for a quiet life away from the movies. In 1947, Sullivan faced down a wife's worst nightmare. She found out her husband, Leland, was cheating on her. Worse than that, he was cheating on her with the glamorous and beautiful socialite, Slim Keith. Sullivan didn't need to think twice. She filed for divorce as soon as she made the discovery, and the split became final in 1948. But nothing is that simple. In the wake of the divorce, Sullivan's family fell apart. While Hayward went to California, Sullivan stayed on the East Coast, and the children shuttled between the two, an arrangement that made no one happy. To add insult to injury, Hayward would often spoil the kids with lavish gifts, then send them back to Sullivan discontented and surly about their more modest life with their mother. In 1955, Sullivan's children dealt her a gut-wrenching blow. Tired of going back and forth across the United States, Bridget and Bill both requested that they permanently move in with their indulgent father and only see Sullivan when they could make the time. This would be terribly difficult for any mother to hear, but Sullivan's reaction was devastating. First, she literally begged her son to stay. When he wouldn't budge, she suffered a full-blown nervous breakdown. The actress began to sob uncontrollably. As her daughter Brooke recalled, "Even from my room the sound was so painful, I went into my bathroom and put my hands on my ears." Sullivan's breakdown got worse before it got better. The star was wound so tightly that she later crawled under the bed and curled herself into a ball, refusing to come out. Sullivan was broken. These desperate times called for desperate measures. After her days-long breakdown, Sullivan knew she needed to get help. She agreed to spend 2.5 months at a private mental institution to recover, though this wasn't common knowledge at the time. To be sure, this experience helped the actress get back her health. Yet tragically, her suffering soon manifested in another form. For many years, Sullivan kept a devastating secret. She was slowly losing her hearing. Born with a congenital hearing defect called otosclerosis, her hearing deteriorated as she aged. For an actress so dependent on sound, this was a terrifying diagnosis. By 1957, her hearing loss was too severe to ignore, and Sullivan was teetering on the edge again. She fell into a deep depression once more. She often wandered around in the middle of the night and had difficulty sleeping. Some mornings she couldn't get out of bed and would stay cooped up in her room for days on end, avoiding anyone who knocked. Once so majestic and feisty, Sullivan was now an echo of the star she used to be. In 1950, just after her divorce from Hayward, Sullivan got married for the 4th and final time, this time to the banker Kenneth Wagg. For once in her life, the relationship was a steady respite for the actress, though it may have lacked the passion of her earlier flings. They were together for over a decade, with Wagg caring for her through her worst moments. Sullivan had so many highs throughout her career, but of the films she made, her favourite was Little Man, What Now? From 1934. Because of the film's topics of poverty and unemployment in World War II, Universal Studios was initially reluctant to make it, but Sullivan herself called it the real thing, and some of the best work she ever did as an actress. Despite her success, Sullivan's parents continued to despise her goals well into her career, but in 1930 they finally bustled into a theatre and witnessed her acting chops firsthand. They couldn't believe their eyes. Even they had to admit their daughter was good, and they never bothered her again. A scout for the influential theatre mogul Lee Schubert also attended the same play as Sullivan's parents, and took word back to his boss that they had a star on their hands. It was Sullivan's first real chance at stardom, and she nearly lost it. When she met with Schubert himself, she was suffering from a bad case of laryngitis and worried that her husky voice would dissuade him. Schubert, of course, absolutely loved her voice and signed her on to his plays. Always the first to make light of any situation, Sullivan developed a go-to joke about this fateful first meeting, quipping that for years afterward, she insisted on standing in every available draft to turn her temporary illness into a permanent huskiness. Sullivan, a Broadway star at heart, never fully let go of her dislike for Hollywood and its studio system. Later in her career, she began to refuse to sign long-term contracts, hating the idea of a studio owning her. She was independent to a fault, and wanted to follow her own aspirations rather than have them dictated to her by men in high places. Today we're only getting to the bottom of the relationship between Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan. The most common interpretation of their relationship claims that while Stewart remained desperately in love with her, she spurned or avoided his advances. Certainly Sullivan's series of marriages to men who weren't Stewart probably weren't encouraging to the poor guy. However, the truth might be much different. When Sullivan's daughter Brooke wrote a book about her mother in 1977, she let out one of Tinseltown's biggest secrets. For all their will they, won't they energy, the book claims that the lovelorn pair actually carried on an affair way back when Sullivan was still married to Henry Fonda, and broke it off forever when they realised it might destroy the friendship. After years of slow decline, Sullivan's flame was extinguished in one sad moment. On New Year's Day 1960, she was found unconscious and barely alive in a hotel bed in Connecticut. Aides rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. She died before she even got there, at just 50 years old. The world was stunned, and then unsettling details emerged. When the autopsy came back, it revealed that Sullivan had died from a barbiturate overdose, leading many to assume that she had tragically taken her own life, exhausted from years of suffering. However, she left no note, and the coroner ruled the incident as an accident. Whatever the truth of her final moments is, we may never know. Sadly, Sullivan's tragic legacy continued past her death. Her youngest children, Bridget and Bill, suffered with mental illness just like their mother, and in October 1960, just months after Margaret's death, Bridget died of an eerily similar overdose. In 2008, Bill took his own life too. Like Sullivan herself, they both lost their lives at far too young an age. Sullivan's passing affected so many, but Jimmy Stewart's response was the most poignant. When he found out, he was shattered. As his wife later described, he became something of a recluse for a while. He lost the spark that had always been there. The spark went out not with the failure of his films, but with the death of Margaret Sullivan. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.